G'day YouTube, Warbles on a lot here with the New Scientist magazine from the 29th of November 2014 with a two-page article commencing on page 30 written by Alan Page Fisk and Taj Shakti Ray, subtitled "Most Violence Doesn't Arise from a Breakdown of Morality, Quite the Opposite." As you can see, it's titled "Violence for Goodness' Sake." It's probably a very timely subject to consider in light of the fact that last night the New South Wales police shot dead a 50-year-old fruitcake because he'd taken 17 hostages in a coffee shop across the road from the Channel 7 newsroom in Martin Place in Sydney. 2 of the hostages died. The raw prawn with a cooked head was shot and killed by the police, and 1 police officer has a gunshot wound to the face. So, most violence doesn't arise from a breakdown of morality, quite the opposite. Why would anyone hurt you? Why would you hurt or kill someone else? Contrary to popular perception, people are rarely violent simply because they lose control and fail to think about right and wrong. They rarely commit violence because they lack empathy and fail to see their victims as fully human. And almost no one is violent because they draw sadistic pleasure from the suffering of others. Across cultures and history, there is generally one motive for hurting or killing. People are violent because it feels like the right thing to do. They feel morally obliged to do it. Bit of a personal aside here. Back in the days when I thought that it was a clever idea to beat children for their perceived transgressions, that's exactly what I thought. I thought I was doing the right thing because that's how I was raised to believe a lot of bullshit. But anyway, I'll say that again. Across cultures and history, there is generally one motive for hurting or killing. People are violent because it feels like the right thing to do. They feel morally obliged to do it. Loss of control, lack of empathy, dehumanisation, self-interest. These are the factors that help facilitate violence, but none of them account for the motives underlying most acts of violence. When people impulsively lash out, on the whole, they don't simply lash out randomly. The truth is that people engage in violence when they feel it is the morally right thing to do. Violence is not a breakdown of morality. It is motivated by moral emotions and judgments. To claim that people are morally motivated to hurt and kill others might sound like a contradiction in terms. This is because many people in the West have been taught to equate morality with the avoidance of pain and suffering. But as laudable as this stance may be, we cannot allow it to cloud our scientific description of the moral psychology that guides human actions. So here, when we use the term, quote, moral, we mean, quote, moral from the perpetrator's point of view, unquote. When we say that violence is morally motivated, we are not justifying violence. We are simply describing the motives, emotions, and judgments of the person committing the violence. We ourselves judge violence to be repugnant, but it is crucial to acknowledge the empirical fact that morality, the sense of, quote, ought, quote, should, or, quote, must, varies between cultures and changes across time. However, violence always functions to create, sustain, and otherwise regulate our social relationships. A person's moral psychology is not fundamentally or intrinsically oriented towards harm avoidance, peacefulness, or altruism. Ultimately, morality is about regulating relationships, and violence is a powerful means to do so. Subheading: driven by love. If your parents spanked you when you were a child, it was probably because they thought it was good for you. They may have hated to do it, but they did it because they felt they had to bring you up correctly. Their parents may have spanked or whipped them in order to raise them as God-fearing, virtuous adults. Looking more broadly, violence, the deliberate infliction of pain, suffering, fear, injury, or death, has long been an integral part of many people's lives around the world. Violent initiations, for instance, create strong communal ties that bind participants to sacrifice their lives for each other. Likewise, the brutal self-inflicted harm formerly committed by Native Americans on their spirit quests creates an irrevocable relationship with a spirit guardian who would empower and protect them in battle. In many cultures, some form of surgical modification of the genitals of men or women is felt to be essential to the creation of a virtuous adult, even, and sometimes especially, if it is frightening and painful. When a woman shoots an intruder to protect her children, it is love for her children that motivates her. Likewise, soldiers often kill to protect their buddies. Some violent acts are punitive. The execution of a murderer, for example, or the bombing of those who bomb us. That's justice as the perpetrator perceives it. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. Dresden for Coventry, Hamburg for London, Cologne and Rostock and everywhere else just got thrown into the mix. In some cultures, when someone dies, the principal mourners cut or burn themselves or amputate a finger joint. In some old civilizations, wives and retainers were killed to accompany the spirit of a dead king, or captives were sacrificed in his honour. Thus, they honoured the dead, showing their love and commitment. A person may also harm someone to morally regulate a relationship with someone else. For instance, a youth who wants to join the Bloods gang may have to kill a member of the Crips gang first. In a culture of honour, a man is morally obliged to attack someone who insults his wife or mother. In short, most violence is morally motivated to create, conduct, protect, redress, terminate, or mourn crucial relationships according to the cultural norms of the group that people belong to. None of this negates the fact that people also have strong motives of care and compassion towards those they have communal or pastoral responsibility for. And none of this negates the fact that most of us find committing acts of violence repugnant and traumatic. But moral motives to do harm may grow strong enough to compel a person to be violent. This may happen in an instant, so they do not have time to reflect on the wider moral implications of their violence. Or a person may carefully ruminate about the morality of violence for years, perhaps like the Fruit Loop in Sydney yesterday. May carefully ruminate about the morality of violence for years while awaiting the right opportunity to violently regulate a relationship. But the motives are equally, quote, moral, unquote, in either case. The foundation of Western legal systems is that people are found guilty and punished for intentionally doing what they know to be wrong. But what happens when people know what they did was right according to their internal moral compass? If we wish to reduce violence, simply increasing the penalties will not work, because people will do what is morally required if they feel their cause is righteous, whatever the consequences. Raw prawn with a cooked head was shot to death at 2:30 in the morning. He had his 15 hours of alleged glory. He thought he was doing something moral for the cause that he believed in. Everybody else thinks he just wanted to go out in a blaze of glory because he was going down the gurgly hole charged with murder and sexual assault, having already been found guilty of writing poison pen letters to the families of deceased Australian service personnel killed in Afghanistan. People will do what is morally required if they feel their cause is righteous, whatever the consequences. It will not reduce violence to simply teach people to step back and consider the victim's feelings and whether the victim deserves harm, because often the perpetrator may decide the victim does deserve violence and may even relish the pain the victim experiences. Instead, we must reorient potential perpetrators to find non-violent ways to regulate their relationships. Moreover, we must make perpetrators know that their violent actions will violate their relationships with people they care about. Family, friends, and leaders must show potential perpetrators that they won't put up with violence. They must make it clear that if the perpetrator injures or kills anyone, they won't just hurt the victim, they will damage their relationships with their own family, their own friends, and their own community leaders. When, for instance, non-violent African American protesters were hosed and beaten during the civil rights movement, it did not evoke guilt in the majority of white American Southerners, but it did elicit the sympathy of the northern states and the international community, and as a result, the American South was shamed and pressured into tolerating integration. Likewise, in US cities plagued by gang violence and homicide, the most successful violence reduction programs rely on communicating to gang members that their violence is not praiseworthy and that it is hurting the people they care most about. For example, in the Cure Violence program, previously known as Cease Fire in Baltimore, Maryland, influential local leaders speaking for the community publicly tell the principal perpetrators that killing is intolerable, and victims and bereaved families confront the killers with the social consequences of killing. Swift and certain legal sanctions are used alongside these meetings, but are insufficient by themselves. Family members and respected community leaders must clearly and forcefully state that violence is wrong. Not just other people's violence, all violence. Changing people's motives and beliefs about violence is difficult and takes time, but that is true of many cultural changes in values and practices. Extreme corporal punishment of youngsters used to be ubiquitous. I was raised to the sound of a stock whip cracking, but is now in steep decline and widely judged to be child abuse. I've had to plead guilty to that. I haven't been into beating kids ever since I received that lesson from life, the universe, and everything, the consequence of my own actions. Domestic violence used to be commonplace and explicitly condoned. Now, an incident of family violence can dominate a news cycle and be widely condemned. Violence is already less condoned and less practiced than it used to be. We have a long way to go, but we have the power to stop violence by making it immoral. There you go. That 50-year-old twisted half-wit who got himself shot to death last night, no doubt firmly believed that he was acting for the most moral of principles when he decided to kidnap some hostages and essentially commit suicide by cop. But I mean, one person with a weapon in the middle of a city of 4 million people that's quivering with anticipation of some kind of homegrown terrorist action, throbbing with heavily armed police and counter-terrorist special weapons and tactics squads. When he went in there at the start of his day, he knew he was going to come out dead. There's no possible way he could have fantasized that he was going to win the confrontation with the firearms. He was apparently a cleric in Iran before he came to Australia and was given political asylum. He'd been found guilty of writing poison pen letters to dead military veterans' families. He thought he had a position of moral authority to be doing that. He was facing multiple 60 or 70 sexual assault charges because in his self-proclaimed role as the fake Sheikh of Sydney, he apparently incorporated sexual assault into his religious practices. He's been disowned by all the Muslims in the world, and rightly so. But he thought he was acting on moral principles, committing violence for goodness' sake. Isn't that why the Australian Air Force is dropping bombs on third-hand Humvees that the Americans gave to the Iraqis to surrender to ISIL? Committing violence for goodness' sake? Going out there to kill the wicked, evil members of the death cult because they're anti-God. Not like the RAAF, who's dropping bombs, causing collateral damage, killing camels on a sand dune. There you go. Violence for goodness' sake. Ciao.